The guy said, ham? I haven't eaten anything today. I wish I had something. Oh, the man pulled out his 2 slices of bread and he said, here, have this. And the little guy took one and ate it. He said, you eat the other, it's probably your lunch. And he said, sure is. So he ate it. Then the little guy looked at him and said to him, well, why are you trying to get this ham? And he explained again about his wife, and she wanted to have a ham for Easter, and if he didn't do it, she would be upset with him, and they'd been in love for so many years. And the little man said, wait, you didn't have to give me any of that bread. You didn't even have to tell me you had it. You did something nice for me. I'm going to do something nice for you. I know how you can get a ham. Well, the man looked at him and said, tell me. Well, there's an ancient hand mill for grinding. It's called a quern. And this quern is a magic quern. You look at it and you say, quern, grind more, whatever it is you want. And it begins to pop out what you want. Grind more grain. And out begins to make heaps and heaps of grain. You might look at it and say, grind more corn. And out comes corn. Not all ground, but just ears of corn. It does what you need. And the old man says, fine, where is it? Well, there is a problem. It's in hell. It's in the devil's lands. He probably doesn't know what it is. He just collects things. He's a pack rat. But you'd have to get it from him. The guy says, how could I ever get it from him? I can give you one hint. The devil loves bacon. Can never get enough of it. He absolutely adores bacon. He'll do anything for bacon. The old man looks at the little guy and he says, ah! And back he goes to the house, runs in the door, because as they've gone through the winter, they've been using up more and more of their stores, and still hanging on the wall in the kitchen is a big flitch of bacon. It just lasts there in the open air. It's salted. And so he cuts half of it off, and his wife says, where are you going with our food? And he says, I'll be back, and out the door he goes. And he runs out into the forest again, and he starts looking for the entrance to hell. And he can't find it here, and he can't find it there. It's not under this tree, and it's not in the back of that hill. And finally he comes to a hill that's mostly rock, and he sees where there's an opening between 2 rocks, and he rolls one of them aside, and indeed there's an opening to a cave. He figures maybe this is it. And he starts in, and just then he can smell sulfur. Well, we know what's burning in hell. And so down he goes. And he follows this cave down and down and down, and it gets really dark, no more outside light. And then it begins to get brighter at the end. And as he gets there, he realizes it's reflected light from flames, and he must have gotten to hell. And he goes in, and there's this huge cavern, and indeed, there are fires burning, there are people being tortured, people on the rack, and people in the Iron Maiden for things they've done bad while they're on earth. And he looks around, away at the far end must be the devil on a throne. Well, takes a look at that devil, and he thinks to himself, well, I can't go tell him I want that quern. You know, that's never going to work, not if he's a pack rat. And he starts looking around. Maybe he can find it and get it away. And he finally, in the corner, finds this great couch pile, you know, all this stuff just piled up. And he sees sticking out on one side, there's the quern. And he looks at it, and he looks at it, and he says, no, no. If I make like I want it, I'm not going to get it. So finally, as he works his way around the cavern, he gets to the devil. The devil says, you're a stranger here, and I've seen you poking around now for a while. What do you want? Did you get sent here? He said, no, no, I came. I've never been here. I just wanted to look around. And meanwhile, you know, under his arm, he's got that big flitch of bacon. And he doesn't say a word about it. The devil looks at him and says, well, why'd you bring food with you? The guy says, food? He says, yeah, under your arm, that flitch of bacon. And, well, man looks down, and oh, that, well, I'm just carrying it with me. He puts it back under his arm. And the devil says, well, you know, I kind of like bacon. Do you think maybe you could share that with me? And man says, oh, no, that's my bacon. And the devil begins to bargain with him for the bacon. And he says, I'll give you eternal life. And the guy says, no, I'm happy the way things are. And the devil offers this, he offers that. And the man keeps turning them down. And finally he says to him, I'll tell you what, you pick out anything you want in this cavern, and you may have it in return for that flitch of bacon. Well, the old man got up, and he goes over into the corner, and he looks through this pile as if he's never seen it before, and he pulls out the quern, goes over to the devil, and here's this dirty, old, rusty, quern. And devil looks and says, you want that old thing? He says, yeah, I'll give you half this flitch for it. And remember, it was half of a big piece to begin with, so it's getting smaller. And the devil looks at him and he says, half? No, I have to have it all. And the man has him right where he wants him, because now the devil is committed to a price. And he gives him that whole flitch of bacon, and he takes the kern, and out he goes. Doesn't give the devil a chance to change his mind or anything. And up he goes that long ramp, and it gets dark behind him, and then you can see the daylight. Out he comes, and he starts running home with this kern. And then he thinks, I better see if this thing works or not. So he stops, and he puts the kern on the ground, and he says, kern, grind more ham. Well, all of a sudden, this great big ham pops up, boom, and another one, boom, and another one, and another one. And he says, no more, no. And then he remembers, stop grinding hams. And it stops. And he picks the very best two and puts them under his arm, and puts the kern under the other arm, and goes home to his wife and delivers it. Well, they used that kern very judiciously after that, enough to give themselves a nice living, keep their farm going, and they lived fairly well after that. Now, he had a brother who had a much larger farm and had done pretty well, didn't really need anything, but one day he thought, I ought to share this with my brother. So he goes over to the brother's house with the kern under his arm, explains to his brother what it's all about, and says, I'd like to loan it to you for a bit. And the brother says, sure, why not? Now, the first thing the brother does is he asks the kern to grind more soup. He loves soup. And the kern starts churning up soup. And it goes across the countertop, and it fills the sink, and it goes on the floor. Goes across the floor, over the sill, and starts going out into the yard before the man remembers how he has to say, grind no more, and the kern stops. And ever after that, that man and his wife also had a nice living. And one day, a friend of the man's, who incidentally was a fishing skipper, came along. And he saw that the man was living better than he had before. So he asked him what had happened. And the man told him. He said, well, my brother brought this over, this kern, and this is how it works, and it's pretty interesting. And so this fishing skipper looked at it, and he said, oh, that's a pretty nice thing. Wish I had one of those, and off he went. Well, that night, he'd been thinking, that kern, the worst thing about fishing is it costs me money to buy the salt because it's imported. I'm going to steal that kern and I'm going to have all the salt I need. So in the middle of the night, he goes back to the brother's house and he takes the kern and goes out. And the next morning, he and his crew get aboard the boat and they go off to sea. And the men say, well, what are we going to do? Just fresh fish and bring them back right away? He says, oh, don't worry. And they get out to where the fish are teeming and they start hauling in fish. And the men say, well, what are we going to do? He says, watch. And in his cabin, he turns to the kern and he says, kern, grind more salt. And it starts to produce salt. And more salt. He has the men come down, they shovel into burlap bags and take it over to the hold and they begin to salt the fish. Catch fish, more salt, fish, more salt, fish, more salt. Meanwhile, that kern is just merrily grinding away, churning out salt. And the skipper realizes he's got a lot of it and he's got to get it cleaned out of his cabin. He starts shoveling it out and well, finally, it fills the cabin so high it starts spilling out of the hatch anyway. It's just so much salt. Finally, well, he says, enough salt already. Stop. Kern doesn't stop. He says, that's it, no more. On it goes. He tries everything he can to make that thing stop. It just keeps churning salt. It comes up out of his cabin. It floods the decks. Eventually it starts pouring down into the main hold itself until finally it fills the entire vessel with salt and sinks it. And to this day, that kern is still in the bottom of the ocean in the Caribbean, churning out salt. Now, if you don't believe me, you said you've been to the Caribbean? Did you stick your finger in the water and taste it? Oh my, anybody else? Because I'll tell you, you go down there now and you put your finger in the water and taste it, it's not sweet water, it's salt, and that's why. Thank you. Here, look at one of those. Oh. How about Block Island? Have you been there? Somebody must have been to Block Island. Ah, hooray. Did you see the monument to the people who were lost on the Empress Augusta? It's on the east shore. Yeah, it's on the east shore of the island, about halfway up. You may not have. The Empress Augusta was a vessel that in the mid-1700s left Europe with a boatload of about 150 immigrants to America. Empress Augusta was actually bound for Philadelphia. These were all Germans. They came from the area of Germany then called the Palatine. And these people were immigrating to an area where they already knew there were a lot of Germans. And as they came off on the voyage, you know, they have enough supplies, the ship has enough supplies to feed them. And excuse me, that's all the time I have left? Okay. Obviously I have too many stories. So, the people are on their vessel, and coming across the ocean, and two things happen. One is they begin to get hit with headwinds, not headwinds they'd expected. And the skipper realized it's going to take him longer to cross than it was. Fortunately, he's got enough supplies, but he begins to ration them. And in rationing them, well, they'll probably make it. And then people began to get sick. Even crew members began to get seasick. Waves and storm and everything, but even the seasoned salt. And as these men were getting sick, finally somebody figured something had to be really wrong. And they checked the water, and the water casks, well, half of them had been used before and not cleaned properly, apparently, because they had something green, scum, growing in them, and this was obviously making people sick. So the captain, to save everybody's lives, breached those casks, let them drain into the bilge. Now they're down to half their water. So he's rationing everything very, very tightly. And as they're coming along across the ocean, actually supposed to be sailing for Philadelphia, they run into more storms. And the first mate decides the skipper is no good. And he gets the crew behind him, and he goes into the skipper's cabin, and in an act of mutiny, he stabs him. He runs him right through with a sword. Captain drops to the deck. And this man takes over. It turns out he's worse than the captain because he's doing this for himself, not even the crew. And he proceeds to start rationing, but the Palatines have to pay for what they get. The crew gets a half a cup of water. The Palatines, for a few pfennigs, they get a rag soaked in the water. They have to squeeze it out to get the water, so obviously they don't get very much. And he does the same thing with the food. And finally, they're just about out of money. And they're beginning to be very ill, they're beginning to be weak, and so on. And still, the winds are against them, the waves are against them, and there's just near riot going on aboard. But of course, the Palatines, well, they begin to die. And as they're losing people, they're praying to God, something has to happen. And then one night, as they're sailing along, and the crew's getting ready to mutiny against the first mate at this point, one of them hollers out that he sees a light. And he sees the light, and the next thing, he hollers he can see breakers. And she piles up on the rocks. And the rocks are off the north end of Block Island. The light they saw was the north light on Block. And she piles up there, obviously way off course. And here it is now, we're in December. They'd started out of Europe in late September. You can see how long they'd been. And, well, boat piles up. The crew bails out, loads their boats, steals everything they can from the weakened Palatines, and they row ashore. Now, one of the ways the people in those days, here we are in the middle 1700s, people on Block Island, well, they farmed and they kept sheep and they were wreckers. And you know how a wrecker worked in those days. One of the ways was they take a lantern and tie it to a donkey's bridle and walk the donkey along the beach. And the moving of the lantern made it look as if it was a ship moving in the water, so you knew you were safe. And in this case, they hadn't had to do it. But they went out and they cleaned everything they could off the ship, but when they went out to do it, they found the Palatine people, the Germans there. They'd been left behind. And so they ferried them ashore. And they ferried all of those people ashore. Some survived, some did not. And then they realized, if they leave the ship there, remember, they are wreckers. They want others to come up on those rocks, but where they get more out of it. And so they have to get that wreck out of sight. And they decide to burn it. And so they torch the boat, and they row back ashore. And here it's flaming away. And as it flames, as it burns, all of a sudden they see a woman climbing the rigging, long hair, long skirt, of course, and she's climbing the rigging, her hair and her skirt catch fire, and she starts screeching and screeching about, she's being consumed by the flames, and then whoosh, the whole thing goes up, and she's gone, and the boat is gone. Now, I asked you about that monument. This is a true story. This actually happened. Since then, the legend, the story is that people in that area, when they see a storm coming in, a nor'easter, well, the way they predict it is about 1 or 2 nights before, they'll see what looks like a flaming ship sailing in from the east toward the north end of the island. Now, we all think that's kind of lore. I discovered a copy of the newspaper in Toledo. It was the only one I could find from when this happened, of a day in November, back in the 1950s. Yeah, back about in the 1950s, 40s or 50s, where the Massachusetts State Police began getting phone calls from southeastern Mass of people seeing a flaming square-rigged ship go sailing by. And then they got reports from out of Block Island. This is published in the Toledo newspaper. Why I couldn't find it anywhere else, I don't know. All I can tell you is that the Palatine Lights always do mean bad luck if you see them. That sighting was followed by a tremendous 3-day nor'easter storm. Thank you. And I'm told that I'm out of time.
Give it up for Hank Savin, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.